Welcome. I'm Debra Anne Clement, and thank you for joining me for the premiere episode of Shortcut to the Soul. It's a weekly podcast about astrology, intuition, healing, and spirituality. Now, some of you may already know me from Anchored in Astrology, which is a radio show I did back in 2008 to 2012. And I was also the co-host of He Says, She Says Astrology with Chris Flisher from Turning of the Wheel. So some of you may be familiar with me from that show. But here I am back on the air. And I'm back on the air because, quite frankly, that's what Spirit is calling me to do. Now, I'm going to be talking about astrology today, but before I dive into the astrology, I just briefly want to introduce myself to those of you who don't know who I am, as well as give you some insight into my personal approach to astrology, and also, let you know what you can expect from this show, in the coming weeks. And so, I am a consulting and teaching astrologer. And like many other astrologers, I was inspired by Linda Goodman's book, Sun Signs. I've been a professional astrologer for more than 25 years now. I have clients, I work with clients from all walks of life, literally all over the world. It's great. It's great. It certainly is my passion. Now, I'm doing it full time for about 10 years now. And before that, I did it part-time, kept it a little bit quieter because I went to law school and I had a career as an attorney for a number of years. I started out in child advocacy, and so, did that until, actually ended up in a sophisticated real estate, and it was a Pluto transit, and I'll just leave it at that. But again, it brought me to what I'm supposed to be doing and the path that I'm supposed to be walking. And so I do, in terms of my practice areas for astrology, I do practice in a number of areas. But really, what do I enjoy the most? What is my passion? It's predictive astrology. And so I consider myself a predictive astrologer, and certainly I have the expertise in natal astrology as well. Now, what can you expect from this show? Well, quite frankly, you can expect a lot of astrology. And some of it will be about current events and current energies that are going on, how it's going to impact your chart. I'll be doing some lessons as well. And what I do want to do a little bit differently this time from Anchored in Astrology is, back then I gave a lot of lessons, but a lot of it was for more like the intermediate to advanced level. And this time around, I want to do a little bit more foundational work, to be honest. And so for those of you who are a little bit more of the beginning level, it'll be a lot easier for you to understand things as I go along. And for those of you who are already, intermediate and advanced, well, hopefully maybe you'll pick up something new, because we're always learning. I know I'm still always learning, and I learn from my clients. I learn from working, with charts. And that's what I always say to anyone when I teach, because it does take practice. This astrology, to me, to be an astrologer, it is something you are called to do because it is so complex. It's something you have to love it and have the passion, to do it, to really stick with it beyond the very basic level. And now I'm also a medium, as in I speak to the dead. So, in the future in shows, I'm going to be discussing that as well. And I may be giving some messages, but certainly I want to talk about being a medium and communicating with the other side, and generally spiritual gifts in general, psychic gifts, spiritual gifts, whatever you want to call them, because everybody has them, different degrees, different levels, and that's something that shows very clearly in the horoscope. And it also shows, if you have the gift, exactly what type of gift you have, and whether or not you're supposed to be working at it, whether or not you're supposed to be earning money from it. And so for me, I've had this gift since mediumship, I'm going to say from really as far back as I can remember. And it was terrifying. It wasn't those, kindly grandmother came. And so I've always denied being psychic. I've denied, anything to do with mediumship, even though I would be drawn to it, but it terrified me. But that's topics for other shows. I've been a Heal Your Life teacher. I've been licensed Heal Your Life teacher since 2002, which I'm, licensed to teach the philosophy of Louise Hay. But I'm also now a Reiki master, and that was something that's relatively new that I've just done in the past year. So that's something new, and again, that's brought in a lot more of healing. And I did that, quite frankly, for myself. I didn't go in taking Reiki initially. It was, again, Spirit led me to do it, but I did it. It helped certainly open myself up, besides a lot of self-healing. And of course, now I can share that information as well. And so Shortcut to the Soul. I named the show Shortcut to the Soul because, it's for years I look and I really believe, because it's been proved to me, so I believe it without a doubt, is that, we come into this lifetime, our soul comes in, and there are certain things that are decided before we're born. And every person your soul promised to meet, every circumstance it agreed to experience, even traits it chose to assume, quite frankly, to help it learn these, learn its lessons that it came here to learn. And of course, the exact lessons it came here to learn. It's all written. It's all written in that celestial record. And that record as a horoscope. I know it as a shortcut to the soul. When I sit with a chart and I look at that wheel, I see the soul. I connect to the soul. And so your horoscope, everyone's horoscope, I guess I should say, yes, of course it reveals your soul's purpose and how it intends to fulfill it. But there are many more details in there than a lot of people realize. And when I say details, I also mean guidance. It's not just laid out, well, here's the lesson that I'm going to learn. That's certainly there. But there's actually advice in terms of whatever the issues are, whatever I'm going to say the challenges are. They show in the chart, and so does the solution, the direction of where you're supposed to go and what you're supposed to do. Everything and everyone, I've always said this, can be found in the horoscope if you know where to look. Now, again, in theory, the heavens, the planets, it's about timing. And they ensure that your soul's plan, your soul's itinerary is carried out on schedule. How so? The eclipses. Eclipses and transiting planets. And when I say transiting planets, I really mean Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Those are the transits, the planets of crisis. They bring crisis at times. And when they activate your horoscope, they trigger. That's the trigger, the timing, the specific events or specific circumstances that were planned by your soul, okay, to help you go forward along your soul's path. Now, does that mean that, do I believe everything is written in stone and, nothing can change? God, of course not. But I do believe there are certain things that are agreed to beforehand. The timing comes, sets them in motion. And then we, meaning also you, right, we determine whether we become the master of our fate or just a casualty of it. Because, it's really... It's like any other road trip, right? You've got your map, you make your plans, you say, I'm taking this route, I'm going to stop here, whatever, take a bathroom break. But the reality is that at any time you can make a decision, and go off path. Oh, there's a different route. I think I'm going to try that. And so, in life, certain things happen. There are certain meetings or certain events. How we handle them, the decisions we make, the decisions maybe that we don't make, or fail to make, and so they make them, right, they're made for us. That's what makes the difference, because we are here to exercise our free will. That's why we're here, to learn. And the truth of the matter is, we're here to learn lessons and get it right. And before you get it right, you always get a lot of opportunities to get it wrong. But at the end of the day, whatever we've agreed to, yeah, that's there. But it's up to us to decide how we're going to get there and whether or not we're going to be successful. So that's a bit about my philosophy and approach, I guess, sort of in a nutshell. And the other thing, I know what I wanted to mention. So one of the things, too, that in the coming weeks, because I'm looking forward to this, and it is related to astrology. But years ago, I'm pretty sure it was Wayne Dyer wrote a book, and I think it was called something like There's a Spiritual Solution to Every Problem. And, that's true. That really is true. But I'm going to say to you that there are also practical solutions to spiritual problems. And a lot of spiritual problems, they show in the birth chart. They absolutely do. And a lot of them have to do with those patterns, with these life lessons that we've come here to learn. Because usually when you've got a pattern in your life that keeps repeating, believe me, you don't need to be an astrologer to know this. There's a reason for it. You're here to learn something, and until you get it right, you keep repeating it. And so I'm looking forward to sharing actually some sound practices, and they're practical solutions that'll help you. It'll help you with your life. It'll help you heal your soul. And, when I'm offering this guidance, even if I may talk about an astrological signature or an aspect. But even if you don't recognize it or you don't understand it, or quite frankly, you don't know if you have it in your chart, I will tell you this. You will definitely recognize the pattern. And if that pattern is you, believe me, that practice will work, because there are practices that I have really, for the most part, discovered on my own, through my own trials, my own lessons, and also through working, thousands of clients. And so there are certain things that I give out routinely for advice, and they work. And so that, again, I said I was being called to do the show because I'm being called. I've worked one-on-one, but now I'm being called to share certain things on a much larger scale. So, also there'll be guests. Let me just say that there will be guests. I used to have guests in interviews when I did Anchor in Astrology. That was always a lot of fun. And so we'll bring in some guests with some different, maybe different philosophies, different, approaches to astrology, but also those connected more to healing, to intuitive, or just different spiritual topics. Because truthfully, it's true that all roads lead to Rome. And that's why very often you can have an astrology reading and you'll hear something, and then you go to a psychic, or an intuitive, and you hear the same thing, right? There's a reason. There's a reason. It's just a different method. So again, intuition, we'll be talking about that, developing your own intuities, a new word, developing your own abilities, your own intuitive abilities, for those of you who are certainly interested, because like I say, everybody has them. Everyone has them. And so we will be exploring that. Now, I'm going to talk about the astrology, and I want to get into astrology, and I want to start with the houses. And I am going to say in terms of daily energy, weekly energy, if you're interested in seeing my take on that, you can follow me on social media, because I do post on Facebook, also Twitter, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. And my handle is at Astrologer Debra, and the Debra is Debra. I also send out a newsletter every other week. It's a detailed newsletter, and it comes out every other Sunday. The next issue will be out on Sunday, July 15th. So by all means, you may want to sign up for that. But I want to start with the houses, because when we're talking about foundation, understanding the houses and what they represent it's really important. So in a general sense, I just want to say, sure, there's these 12 sections. We call them the 12 houses. They're not, depending on, they could be all the same size. It depends on house systems. I use the Placidus house system, so the houses and charts I create are not, always the same size. But each one of these houses, what does it represent? Well, each one represents different life areas, different people, different relationships, even different talents and abilities, as it turns out, that relate to your life personally and to your experiences. So, again, if some of them are empty, that's fine, because the truth is really, everybody has empty houses, unless you really fill them with all the asteroids and the sensitive points, because there are 12 houses, there are 10 planets, and quite frankly, sometimes it's good to have an empty house. And there's really no such thing as an empty house when you really do the whole synthesis, because every house has a sign on it. Every sign has a planet, and that planet, directs the house. So, like I say, there's no such thing as an empty house. An empty house does not mean empty life experience. All right? If your second house and money is empty, doesn't mean you're going to, live a life of poverty. Again, seventh house is empty. Doesn't mean you're not getting married. You can have a very full seventh house, and it's a very important, relationships can be very important for you. And depending on the layout, if you're here to learn about relationships, you may have a lot of relationships, and a lot of them may be, quite frankly, train wrecks. But in the horoscope, the natural horoscope, sometimes you'll hear someone say the natural third house is ruled by Gemini. So in the natural horoscope, the first house is Aries, the 12th house is Pisces. And in your horoscope, of course, if you don't have Aries rising, it's going to fall differently. So I want to just do a rundown for starters of the 12 houses. And so your first house, which is the house that holds your ascendant or your rising sign, it represents the physical body, your physical self, So your appearance, and it can be, yes, your physical appearance, but also the way you carry yourself. So when you're walking in the room, that first impression, here we're at a party, I'm sitting at on the couch, you happen to walk in, and I get a first impression of you. I'm seeing your ascendant when you walk in. Okay, that's why I say I'm seeing the physical body. I'm also seeing, again, people call it a mask. I don't really call it a mask, but I'm just going to say it's the first impression. It also, though, speaks to your approach to life. The sign on that first house, a lot of the qualities, how do you approach life? Do you throw yourself into it? Are you a little bit shy? Are you a little bit cautious? It just, in the really general sense. But the other thing about the first house is that the rising sign, every sign, right, is connected with a planet. And so whatever your rising sign is, the planet that rules it is your chart ruler. So if Aries is rising, Mars is your chart ruler. If Leo is rising, the Sun is your chart ruler. And I'm mentioning that because when I read a chart, the sun sign, your sun is important, don't get me wrong. But that chart ruler, that to me is the most important one, because that is the chart ruler. It drives the chart. And really, if you've got Leo rising, when I look, well, then it's the sun, I'm really seeing you. But let's say you've got Aries rising. I'm going to look for Mars. And Mars in its sign, in its house, and all the aspects it makes in your chart, okay, its condition. And by its condition, I mean, is it retrograde, let's say, or is it intercepted, which might be a little advanced for some of you. That tells me about you. So if I could only analyze one planet in the entire chart, I would pick the chart ruler, and I could tell you a lot about yourself. So the first house, but the first house for the most part, again, is the physical self, it's the approach to life. And then we get to the second house. And so the second house is a Taurus, is in the natural zodiac, I'm saying it's a Taurus house, right? But the second house is about money. It's about money, it's about assets. And so let's talk about money, because the second house is about your attitude towards money. It describes your attitude. Are you free with it? Are you cautious with it? Do you worry about not having enough? It also describes how you earn your money. And so second house money, let me just say this, usually speaks to more of a salary, something that's a little bit more stable, a little bit more solid, a little bit more secure. But it does speak to how you earn your money. And so very often, the type of career you have or the field you're in sometimes can actually be shown from the second house. And it also shows not only how you earn your money, but your attitude towards saving money. Again, do you stock it? Do you save it? Is it easy come, easy go? What do you spend it on? Your attitude towards spending. And again, what kind of stuff do you buy? Because, hey, the second house, it's the house of assets and possessions. And by that we mean it's the stuff that we buy, tangible assets, portable assets. You can move them. It is not real estate. It is not real property. Okay? So again, do you spend it on books? Do you spend it, on entertainment? That can be all shown very much by the second house of money. Now, the third house, we say also the third house is the house of communications. And that's true. It is the house of communications. Speaking, writing, brings in teaching, brings in education. We usually talk about it as lower education, like, kindergarten to high school. And when we talk about communication, that can also be negotiating, right? Being a facilitator, being an MC for that matter, a counselor, an agent. So communications really takes in a lot. And of course, it's also writing. And it's the house of the mind. Okay? It's the house of the mind. We say the concrete mind. And so it speaks to how you think, how you learn. Are you a good listener? It's all in the third house. It's also a house of the local area, and that means local trips, local neighborhood. It is also the house that describes transportation, your car. What kind of car do you have? Do you have a luxury car? Do you have a fast car? What's the attitude towards, I'm going to say sometimes towards transportation. And transportation, we're talking ground transportation. That's why we say local trips. Sometimes we mean road trips by buses, by trains, or by car. Third house is also distribution systems, and that's something that's overlooked because third house is actually associated with the postal system. And so, if you have a business, I'm just saying, and you're selling a product, the distribution system, how you get it to your, to your customers, that's third house. So if someone's got like a car service or you're a dispatcher or something, that's third house. And so the other thing though about the third house is that it is the first of 3 relationship houses, because the third house rules side-by-side relationships. Your siblings, your cousins, and neighbors. All right, so it is the first relationship house. Now, the 4th house, we say home and family. So let's talk about home and family. Traditionally, 4th house is associated, we used to say the mother. I like to say the nurturing parent because, usually one's a little bit more nurturing and one's a little bit more authoritative. And it can be a little bit tricky, quite frankly, when you're interpreting a chart. That's what I say, who's the mom, who's the dad? So very often for mom and dad, I look at the moon for mom, I look at Saturn for dad. But if you're looking at the 4th house, again, nurturing parent. Now, it's your family, the family in general, but it's like family patterns as well. All right? And I like to think of the 4th house as the ties that bind, or, when it's not so great, the ties that strangle. But it's also, I'm going to say, your spiritual DNA, in the sense that there are family patterns sometimes that are repeated from generations. That's the 4th house. And so it describes also the atmosphere of the home where you were growing up, as well as very often the home that you established for yourself. Is it busy? Is it serene? Is it chaotic? And it also represents our unconscious patterns, okay, patterns that we're not aware of. And of course, it's our private life. I want to mention that. It's our private life. And it's real estate. Now, here's where you have the real property. And I like to just make this point because people tend to think, we think of real estate, we think of the home, and that's true. And it can be a farm, and it can be unimproved land. It could be a cemetery. It could also be a hotel. It can be an office building. And that's why very often when a person changes their job, sometimes the 4th house is activated. It's not a move from the home, but it is a move from one building to another. It's that change of office. Now, house number 5. So house number 5, right? House number 4 in the natural zodiac is Cancer. House number 5 would be Leo. 5th house is the house of pleasure. 5th house is a house of expansion. So is house number 9, okay? But house number 5, because I want you to think about this, it's a house of pleasure. It's romance. It's a house of birth, right? Children. Pregnancy is associated with the 5th house. It's creative. It's fun. It's entertainment. It might be whatever your kind of entertainment. It might be the theater. It can be the performing arts. It could be sports. It could be your hobby. It's everything that you're passionate about. That actually is, you find that right there in the 5th house. Now, when it comes to romance, the 5th house is, we used to call it love affairs. But really, romance for the 5th house is Mr. or Ms. right now. It's dating. It's not that committed union. That's the 7th house. So your relationships start out in house number 5. They may or may not make it to house number 7, okay? And it's sort of an interesting thing because you could have a 5th house that's wonderful, that is so positive and easy to attract, I was going to say suitors. My God, is that? But that's a blast from the past for a term. But you can certainly attract romance very easily. And so your date, you meet someone and they start out great. And then when you get serious, though, it's like, who is this person? Or it takes a different turn. Well, and that's sometimes because the 5th house may be an easy breezy house for you, but the 7th house may have a little bit more of obligation attached to it. But the 5th house, if you think of everything it covers, like I say, there's all this sort of positive events. It's expansion. It's creativity. It's also the house where we give our love. Okay, we give our love to others. House number 6. So in the natural zodiac, house number 6 is ruled by Virgo. And it is the house of work and service. It's health, physical health. It's also pets. So work and service, it's the job. It's the employment. You're working for someone. And it's also work that's kind of like, the work we don't want to do sometimes is like drudgery, okay? It is a house of obligation. And so when we talk about employment, it also rules people that you work with, co-workers, as well as people that you employ. And that actually includes, they used to say servants, but if you hire someone to clean your house, that person, where do you find them? You find them in your 6th house. Now, it's a physical house of health. And so it is associated, with people, doctors to a point, but also technicians, all right? Technicians, because there's a debate, there's rulers, there's co-rulers of doctors, but health, physical health is certainly in the 6th house, but it's more, I'm going to say, of technicians, medical technicians. It's my take on it. Now, when we're talking about health, that brings in exercise. That brings in diet, your nutrition. That's what do you eat, right? How well you eat or not. That is the 6th house. And so when we're looking at the health or the condition of your health, as well as your attitude towards exercise, by the way, you find that in house number 6. And so it's very much, like I say, about the physical body. Now, I mentioned pets because the 6th house, it's about your domesticated pets, your dogs, your cats. They're in the 6th house. And so you can learn a lot about, again, a person's attitude towards pets. Do they love pets? Are they an animal person? Do they not like them? And generally, Virgo is a sign, it's very much about self-improvement. And so the 6th house is also an area where we work on improving ourselves. And we tend to be a little hard on ourselves because it is the Virgo house, but it's also a house of self-improvement. So house number 7. House number 7 is the 2nd relationship house. It's the house of marriage and committed relationships or marriage-like relationships. Also business partners. It's your one-to-one relationships. Now, the truth of the matter is we'll say, well, your siblings, your brothers and your sisters, they're in the 3rd house and mom is in the 4th house. But those relationships sometimes also are 7th house as well because it's a one-to-one relationship. And here's the thing about the 7th house. It's the house of marriage, right? Well, it's also the house of divorce. It's ruled by Libra in the natural zodiac, right, which is associated with the law. So your adversaries, your competitors, they are also, I hate to say open enemies, that was the old phrase they used to use, they're in the 7th house as well. And those are one-to-one relationships, okay? They can be there. Now, that's why I say sometimes you have a sibling and listen, they're your sibling and you can love them, but you may compete with each other, and that's what may make it a 7th house relationship. It is also your business partnerships. It's also your best friends, your close friends, okay, the ones that you confide in, and as well as I'm going to say, your frenemies fall in there as well. It's also clients. If you are in a client-driven business, like I am, clients are 7th house. Those are one-to-one relationships, people that you consult one-to-one, 7th house. And that's why I say, so it really takes in a lot. It's also the public at large. So let me mention that before I go on to house number 8. So house number 8 in the natural zodiac is ruled by Scorpio. And it is the house of, right, we say sex, death, rebirth, transformation, shared resources. So let's talk about it because there's a lot to talk about with the 8th house. It is a house of sex. It's a house of intimacy. And in that respect, if you're looking at pregnancy, there's a connection to the 8th house. It is the house of death and the house of rebirth. Neptune is associated with the soul. My attitude, honestly, too, is that Pluto as well. I associate actually Pluto with the soul as well. And personally, I go to Pluto first and Neptune second. But again, that's my approach. Now, we talk about birth and transformation. And the 8th house, when you think of it as being, the underworld. So that's why it's associated with estate matters, inheritance, anything to do with goods with the dead. And we also talk about it, you'll hear and say, well, it's other people's money and other people's support. And I want to talk about that because, first of all, other people's support, that's their backing. You need so many signatures on a petition. You're running for office. You need my vote. That's 8th house. So that's why a lot of politicians, you will see the 8th house is prominent. Okay. The other thing, though, about the 8th house, when we're talking about other people's money, so sure, that's an inheritance that comes to you. But that can also be gifts. Yes, it can be lottery winning. That's what we all like to think about. But it can also be public assistance, or back when I was a kid, they called it welfare, because again, it's money. They call it unearned money, and I tell you the truth, I don't like that. And the reason being is that yes, some money is not earned. If you win the lottery, it's not earned. But quite frankly, there are certain things that come through the 8th house, like retirement benefits or social security. You know, I'm sorry, but hey, I earned that. So that's why I don't like the term unearned, okay, in terms of earned money. But it's another source of money. It's not a salary. It's not, and that's the way that I look at it. It's also client money. So again, if you're client-driven, business, 8th house is client money. It's also money that comes through royalties. Okay, things if you write a book, royalties, money that comes through licensing, franchising, intellectual property. And it is also associated, with the taxes and with debt, D-E-B-T, just to make that clear. Besides death, it's also a house of debt. And that's what's associated with mortgages, because when you take out a mortgage, right, or credit card, you're going into debt. And it's a medical house. Yeah, the 8th house is associated with surgery. If we're looking at dates for surgical, to have a surgery date, going to look at that 8th house, absolutely. And of course, it is a psychic house because it's the underworld. And it's also the house of crime, right? Crime. When I look at the 8th house, and also I just want to mention scholarships, that's also very much, 8th house. But it's crime, it's murder, it's incest, it's taboos. The 8th house also covers everything terrifying and everything that people do not want to face, do not want to talk about. Is very much, 8th house. Now, the 9th house. 9th house is a house of expansion, right? In the natural zodiac, it's a house of Sagittarius, the house of abundance. And so when you're looking at Sagittarius, the 9th house is associated with higher education. And we say foreign travel or long distance travel, okay, and knowledge. And I want to mention the higher education and the knowledge, because certainly it does speak to, I'm going to say, higher education like university and going for a PhD. But it's also about enlightenment, and that brings in philosophy. It is a house of religion. It's also a political house, because again, philosophy goes in there. And when you're talking about knowledge, depending on your chart, it can speak to knowledge that, again, academics, but it's also things that are self-taught. It's just about higher knowledge, okay? It's adult learning. That's how I'm going to call that. It's also a house of publishing, and today I'm going to say it's media, because with the house number 3 is actually connected to the local press or the domestic press, and the 9th house is more like the foreign press. But media, media keeps evolving. And there's different ways that things get published today. And so that's why the 9th house, I will say it's publishing, but I'll very often say it's a house of media. And it is also, let's see about the 9th house. So the house of expansion. And I just want to talk about that. When we talk about expansion, it's also a house of excess. Because we like to think of abundance as a good thing, right? But let's be honest, we can go overboard as well. Abundance is that double-edged sword. So it is a house, like I say to you, of expansion, but also of excess. And let's see, am I missing anything off of the 9th house? Oh, it's also the house of grandchildren. Okay, it's a house of grandchildren. And even though the 9th house is not a relationship house, it's a house where you find your grandchildren. So certainly from your first child to grandchildren. So mention that. House number 10. It's the highest point in the chart. And call it the midheaven. The 7th house is the descendant. The 10th house, 4th house is the IC. Skip that, sorry about that. So the 10th house is the midheaven. And we say it's the career. It's the career and it's the calling, and they are not always the same thing. It is also the dominant parent or the authoritative parent. Okay, in the old days it was dad, but it's the authoritative parent. And it also represents your boss. Anyone who's in authority, okay, over you is found in the 10th house. So what type of boss do you tend to attract or end up with? And you look at your 10th house. It's also your status and your reputation. And your status, well, it's your professional status, but it is also your personal status. And, status is, you're single, you're married, you're a homeowner, you're a tenant. So this, again, it's a broad term. And it also, where the 4th house represents your private life, well, the 10th house, which is the opposite house, that is your public life. And so one of the things it also describes is how comfortable you are in the spotlight, being in public. Oh, the 9th house is public speaking. So I knew there was something else. It's public speaking. But again, being in the spotlight and also being in authority, being a boss, being in a charge. in charge. How comfortable are you, with that, and that's certainly, we see that through the 10th house. Now, the other thing I do want to say about the 10th house, so it's a house also connected to achievements, honors. So if somebody, you win an Oscar, the 10th house is going to be activated, or the ruler to the 10th house will be activated. Because again, anything that becomes public, that's the 10th house. Your career and your calling with the 10th house, very often it will describe the type of, of career that you have. In terms of the calling, sometimes the career is the calling, and I have seen that. But many times, and especially if there are certain signs on the 10th house, I'm going to do that in another lesson, or certain planets, it's more likely to be two distinct things. So house number 11. House number 11 in the natural zodiac is Aquarius. The 10th was Capricorn. I've got to get this straight. So this is the third relationship house, because the 11th house, that's your group relationships. Okay, your peers, your colleagues. And it's called the house of friendship, and it is, but they're casual friends. These are your casual friends and acquaintances. You enjoy them, maybe you go out, to lunch with them once in a while, but they're not your close friends, okay? And 11th house, you also very often find stepchildren there as well. Just going to mention that. Now, we talk about groups, large groups and associations. And so a lot of your nonprofits or not-for-profit groups fall in there. Politics, political groups fall in there. Part of the government is found in there. And also unions, just as an example when you think of groups, because it can be a local group, like, a local charitable group, but it can also be, like I say, a union falls under that 11th house. It's a progressive house. It's the house, of course, we say that rules astrology, because it's the Aquarius house. But it really is also your hopes and they say hopes and goals or hopes and wishes. So when I think of the 11th house hopes and goals, that's how I was taught, I think of them more as personal goals. Now, a personal goal may be a professional goal, but just to be distinct, your ambitions, that's your 10th house. But the 11th house, whatever the goal is, even if it's a professional one, that's the type of thing you really hold. It's like it's in your heart. Maybe you don't even tell everybody about it, but it's something that's really personal to you and very meaningful to you. And finally, we get to the 12th house. And so the 12th house, when I was learning astrology, it was called the house of sorrow. And the truth is, there's truth to that. It is a house of sorrow, of grief, guilt. That's all part of the 12th house. It's also, the 6th house is a house of service. The 12th house is known as the house of sacrifice. It's confinement. It's associated with hospitals and prisons and hospice. And it's also a house of karmic debts. It's also a house of emotional health. Again, the 6th house is physical health. The 12th house is your emotional health. Now, it is a spiritual house. It's a creative house. It's a house of clairvoyance. And so when you look at that 12th house, while you do have the shadow side, the addictions, let's say, but then you have the 12th house, which is, again, that higher calling, the spirituality. And that's all connected to to that 12th house. And so it's also the house that's connected with sleep, with dreams. So I wanted to mention that as well. And when you're looking about the past, anything from the past, now that includes past life, but it also includes, people and events from the past as well. And when you look at the chart, okay, because that was a sort of off the top, a rundown of the 12. You hear houses operate in pairs. And so the first house is opposite the 7th. And the first house is I, and the 7th house is you. So it's sort of the I versus the we, and they'll call it it's the axis of relationships. But again, it's I'm going to say the I and the we. The 2nd and the 8th house, which they call the axis of desire, it's my money versus our money. Oh, 8th house, shared resources. I'm telling you, there's so much to the 8th house. So it's shared resources. It's your partner's money, okay, but it's also money that you share together, that you've commingled, all right, shared resources. And so again, the 2nd and the 8th has to do, it's a financial axis, okay, but they also call it the axis of desire. Again, varies from astrologer to astrologer. The 3rd and the 9th houses, So it's an interesting thing about it's the axis of knowledge, okay? But when you think about it, third house and ninth house both involve travel. One is local, one is long distance. And they also involve education, knowledge, and the mind. But the third house is more about, we say, the rational mind, the concrete mind. Ninth house is more of enlightenment. It's the abstract mind. Your fourth and your 10th houses, well, you find a parent in each one. So that's the parental axis, okay? But it's also your fourth house is your, we say, the inner world. 10th house is the outer world. It's your private life in the fourth house. Your public life is the 10th house. Houses 5 and 11, axis of creativity. So the fifth house, it is this creative house. And again, whatever is creative to use. And it might be, so we talk about entertainment in there, performing arts, whatever is type of creativity, okay? And 11th house is the Aquarius house. And it's also creative, but it's more creative in the terms of, it's more like inventions and technology or progressive, things of that nature. But they are creative. But house 5 is love given. House 11 is love received. House 5 are children, traditionally it's biological children. 11th house, like I say, are stepchildren. And then we have houses 6 and 12. And it's the axis of service and sacrifice. I like to just call it the axis of service because, I just prefer it. But the 6th house is practical service, and the 12th house is, to me, more of a spiritual service, okay? But really, when you're looking at the 6th and the 12th house, there is that element of the 12th house of sacrifice. And that's serving to where, you burn yourself out. You have nothing left to give, and you're just really going on empty, and you're giving and you're giving. And another thing, and I think I'll wrap it up on this, but I want to just say one other thing about the houses. So houses number 1, 5, and 9 in the horoscope, which in the natural zodiac would be Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. They're known as houses of life, okay? They're the houses of life. And they're houses of expansion is another way to think about it. Because that first house, like I say, it's your approach to life. It's getting into life, going out there, right, with life. The 5th house is this house of creativity. The 9th house, of course, in and of itself, we say is a house of expansion, but it's this house of knowledge. There's growth associated, really, with all three of those houses. And so again, 1, 5, and 9 are houses of life. They're the fire signs. Houses 2, 6, and 10, which in the natural zodiac are the earth signs. It's Taurus, it's Virgo, it's Capricorn. They're known as the houses of substance. They're physical houses, okay? They're also known as physical, meaning, things, tangible achievements. They're also very productive, and because the second house, Taurus is the most productive sign in the zodiac. But it's connected to our income. They're the work houses, career houses. Sometimes people refer to them that way as well. But they are considered the houses of substance because they're associated more, I'm going to say material. Material is a better word to use it. They're connected more with material things. The second house, money, resources, material resources. And the 6th house, you're talking about resources. If you're talking about work and service, seriously, people are resources, human resources. And the 10th house is certainly more about tangible achievements. So I really necessarily would not use the word resources for it. But again, it's about tangible achievements, okay, things that you can actually measure. Then you have houses 3, 7, and 11. And those are the houses of relationships. Those are the air signs, Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, right? Side-by-side relationships, one-to-one relationships, and your group relationships. And then finally you have the water signs, or I should say houses 4, 8, and 12, which are ruled in the natural zodiac by Cancer, by Scorpio, and by Pisces. And so they're known as the houses of endings, okay? But I'm also going to say to you they are the psychic houses. The 4th house, which I probably skipped over, but it's ruled by the moon. It's an intuitive house. It's a house of intuition. The 8th house, by all means, is a psychic house. It's the underworld. And the 12th house is a house of certainly clairvoyance and communing with the other side. But they're houses of endings because the 4th house in astrology also describes your circumstances at the end of your life. Doesn't mean it's describing how you're going to die or when you're going to die or anything like that. But it describes your circumstances at the end of your life. The 8th house is the house of death, right? It's death, it's birth, and of course transformation, but it's the house of death. And then we get to the 12th house, right, which is also, connected, honestly, to death, also has a connection to suicide, as well as, the spirit, the soul, whatever you want to call it, as well, in our past lives, in our past incarnations. And so that is the reason why I'm just going to say that they are called the houses of endings. But I actually do look at them as the intuitive houses. The other thing about those water houses and the water signs, earth signs have their reputation for the money and wealth, okay? But I'm going to tell you, it's the water signs and the water sign houses where wealth is in the chart. There's an emphasis there. And, I always sort of think about it because when you think about Cancer and Neptune, they're ruled by the moon and Neptune, which both, think about all the, I hate to say the wealth, but it's the oceans, right? And everything that's beneath. The 8th house is the underworld, everything beneath. Again, it's beneath the surface. What's the oil, whether it's the gas. And so, the 8th house, of course, is a money house to begin with. But just from doing the charts, I've seen people, like I say, real wealthy, those houses, 4, 8, and 12, tend to be very strongly activated, or the water signs for that matter. And so, anyway, this wraps up the premiere episode. I want to thank you again for joining me, and for Shortcut to the Soul. If you like the show, please by all means subscribe to it. And I will be back, and I can tell you in the next episode, actually I'm going to be talking about the eclipses, because we have 3 eclipses this summer. And so I am going to be talking about the eclipse and how it will potentially impact you by your sign, and by, if you're familiar with your chart, great, but if you're not, I'll be talking about it based on your sun sign. So again, this is Debra Anne Clement. Thank you for joining me, and may Jupiter's blessings be your constant companion.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. To schedule a consultation, please visit DebraClementAstrologer.com.